Shavua Tov, good vach, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Let's light up the darkness on a Saturday night. What a great way to start the week with some beautiful learning and some enigmatic learning we'll have tonight. Puzzling and odd. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Carla in Brazil, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in mid-Missouri. Our last Shabbos episode before 2024. Paul is in the house. Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, Shandora in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Lolly in Southern California, Joe in the Inland Empire, Guy in Ohio, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida. Ella says shalom. Welcome, everybody. Yeah. Our last post-Shabbos class in the year 2023. Let's hope 2024 is better. Can always be better, right? Can always be better. I would say 2024 has the potential to be a lot better than 2023, but who knows? What God has planned for us, I trust God. Whatever God has planned for us, it's for the best. Wait a minute. Let's get that reloaded there. Excuse me. I'm fighting off a cold. You probably heard me sniffling yesterday in class. The sniffles are not too bad. I am coughing a bit, so I apologize in advance. Hopefully my voice will hold up. Okay, we are working our way through chapter 6 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Our daf today's page 58. We're continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1. Generally, we're talking about damages that are paid when an animal causes damage by eating or trampling. But there's this exception or exemption if the owner of the animal took reasonable precautions to guard the animal from escaping. And so if he was not negligent, if he fulfilled his obligation to properly safeguard the animal, and then some freak occurrence happens, then he might be exempt in certain circumstances according to some opinions. And once we got into the subject of what is adequate safeguarding, what is proper safeguarding, we had a very interesting discussion about the law of somebody who finds a lost object and what are his or her obligations to safeguard that object during the period, before it becomes possible to return the object. Now we're back to our Mishnah, and we come to a very, very curious passage and resulting discussion. So our Mishnah said, if the animal fell into a garden and derives benefit, the owner pays for the benefit that it derives. Now, falling into a garden is as opposed to entering a garden, right? So it's not that my animal left my property and entered my neighbor's property by walking over or even jumping a fence or tunneling under a fence or jumping through a breach in the fence or something like that. It's not even that I was walking my animal in the public domain and it scampered off into somebody's private field. But it's some kind of freak occurrence where the animal literally falls into someone's garden. It's almost like, I have seen images like of a helicopter lifting a bull and carrying it from one place to another. And it's as if, the helicopter was flying low when it did that and the rope broke, right? And suddenly the bull lands. It's not hurt, but it lands in somebody's garden bed. And now two things happen. One is when the bull lands, it lands on a bunch of vegetables and flowers, rolls around, and it causes damage in somebody's garden bed. And then the bull is hungry and it starts eating the vegetables and flowers and plants in that garden bed. So those are two different kinds of damage. The damage it does by falling in, maybe trampling, maybe rolling, and the damage that it does by eating, right? But the important thing is that it didn't enter, it fell into this garden bed. So if the animal fell into a garden and derives benefit, the owner pays for the benefit that it derives. And this would seem to be to the exclusion of the damage that it causes by walking, trampling, rolling, etc. In other words, if the animal eats while it's there, okay, the owner of the animal has to pay the owner of the garden for what his animal ate, because after all, if his animal hadn't been eating in that person's garden, it would have been eating somewhere else. You have to feed your animals, so you have to pay for the benefit that the animal derived. But it would seem that since it was a freak occurrence, when the animal fell into the garden, that its owner is not liable for the damage caused by the fall or subsequent moving around in the garden. So that's what the Mishna says. The animal fell into the garden and derives benefit. The owner pays for the benefit that it derives. Rav says this is referring to a case where the vegetables soften the impact of striking the ground, and the owner pays for this benefit of the animal being saved from injury. Okay, so you have to pay for some of the damage that it did. The vegetables broke its fall in the same way that if it, fell into a haystack rather than falling on the concrete, it would have saved it from injury. And therefore, any damage that it did to the vegetable gardens, you have to pay the amount that you would have paid to put a haystack under your animal when it took that fall. Now, the Gemara comments, this statement of Rav indicates that the owner pays only for what occurred while the animal landed. But if the animal then ate from the garden, the owner is not required to pay even for the benefit that the animal derives. Did Rav say that? So again, what they're saying is, well, Rav says it only pays for the benefit of the softening of the fall, which must be to the exclusion of the benefit it derived by eating. But did Rav say that? We have not established that, as we shall see. So, first the Gemara says, shall we say that Rav conforms to a standard line of reasoning, as Rav says that in a case where one placed his produce in the courtyard of another person without permission, and an animal belonging to the owner of the courtyard ate the produce and was sickened thereby, the owner of the produce is not liable, as he can claim, well, the animal should not have eaten it. And similarly, here the owner of the animal can say, this animal fell through no fault of mine, and so it is not my fault that it ate while it was there. And the sages of the Gemara say, how can these cases be compared? One could say that Rav said there, in the case of somebody who, without permission, stored his produce in the courtyard of another person, and then an animal belonging to the owner of the courtyard ate that produce and was sickened by it. According to Rav, the owner of the produce that put it there without permission is, he may be liable for taking up space, and he has to remove his produce. And if his produce caused damage by it's sitting on top of stuff, he might have to pay for that. But because an animal came over and ate that produce, the animal has some kind of independent agency. And so according to Rav, he's like, I never gave that animal permission to eat my produce. True, I didn't have permission to put my produce in your courtyard, but nevertheless, your animal shouldn't have eaten my produce. And so if it got sickened thereby, I'm not liable. Now, that's a minority view. That view did not prevail. But still, we're just discussing what Rav's view is. Now the Gemara is saying, okay, well, Rav said that about, the owner of the courtyard's animal shouldn't have eaten the produce of somebody who put that produce in the courtyard even without permission. But why are we going to compare that case to our case at hand of the animal that fell into somebody's garden? These cases are not comparable at all. How can these cases be compared? One could say that Rav said there that the animal should not have eaten the produce. This claim is relevant where the animal itself was injured by eating another person's produce, because the owner of the produce can say, I will not pay because the animal should not have eaten. This is a claim to exempt the owner of the produce from paying the owner of the animal. Did Rav say that when the animal causes damage to another person's produce, the owner can exempt himself from paying the owner of the produce by stating the same claim? No, these cases are not parallel at all. Rather, and now we're on page 58a, one cannot make such an inference from Rav's statement. Rav is speaking utilizing the style of, it is not necessary. And this is how we are to understand his statement. It is not necessary to state that if the animal fell into the garden and ate from its produce, that the owner pays for the benefit his animal derives of what he ate. Of course you have to pay for that. But if the produce softened the blow of striking the ground and thereby the animal avoided injury, one might say that the owner of the animal should not pay on the grounds that the owner of the garden may be viewed analogously to one who repels a lion from another's property. In such a case, although the latter benefited from his action, he is not obligated to pay for it. Right? If I repel a lion from entering your property and causing harm there because I was doing the mitzvah of protecting your property, I can't later come to you and say, hey, I repelled a lion from entering your property. Pay me. You didn't have a contract with me. You didn't ask me. I fulfilled an obligation, a mitzvah actually. But I can't expect payment for that because we didn't agree that I would protect your property from lions. So can we extend that principle here? That's what's being suggested. In such a case, although the owner of the property benefited from the one who repelled the lion, he's not obligated to pay for it. And similarly, in this case, one might think that the owner of the animal does not pay even for the benefit that the animal derived by falling on something soft. And for this reason, Rav teaches us that the owner of the animal must pay for any benefit that it received, right? So if the animal just walks around and tramples flower beds, it doesn't benefit from that. If it just landed in the garden and it landed in the dirt, and it could have landed anywhere in any kind of dirt, there's no particular benefit to the animal. But if it landed on some kind of cushy vegetable patch that softened its fall and prevented it from getting hurt, and in the process ruined those vegetables, then most definitely the animal received benefit, right? Maybe its life was saved because it fell from a great height. So yes, you pay for that because it's a benefit, not because it's a damage to the owner of the garden bed, but rather because it's a benefit to the owner of the animal that had its fall softened. And so the Gemara asks, but why not say that this is indeed the law and the owner of the animal should be exempt from paying for the benefit of his animal not being injured? Right? After all, the owner of the animal did not drop his animal into the garden. He didn't act negligently. It was through no action or fault of his own that his animal ended up falling into somebody else's garden bed. So, okay, he received the benefit that the animal's fall was softened, but he didn't ask for that. So why should he have to pay? And the Gemara answers, one who repels a lion, right? If we're going to make these cases parallel, one who repels a lion from entering another person's property does so with intent, knowing that he would be ineligible for payment. By contrast, this owner of the garden did not act with intent. No one asked him if his garden could be used to soften the blow of the animal that fell into it. And he would have preferred for the incident not to have happened. Obviously, he would have preferred that his vegetable patch not be ruined by the animal's fall. So alternatively, one could say that one who repels a lion from another's property does not thereby have any loss himself. By contrast, this owner of the garden has a loss in that his produce is damaged. So the Gemara asks, how did the animal fall? In which case, does this law apply? And Rav Kahana says, it slipped on its own urine. And Rava says, another animal belonging to the same owner pushed it, causing it to fall there. Well, now these are very different circumstances, right? First of all, if you talk about another animal pushed this animal that ended up falling into the garden bed, seems like it would make a difference whether it was just some third party's animal or another animal belonging to the owner of the animal that ultimately took the fall. If it's two of his animals fighting with each other and one of them ends up falling in the neighbor's patch, Well, that sounds like it is some kind of negligence on the part of the animal's owner. I mean, now you can say, okay, well, it's his property that caused his property to enter somebody else's property. That would seem to be, his responsibility. But if it's just some third party, that would be different. And this idea of the animal slipping on its own urine, well, that just sounds like circumstances beyond control, unavoidable accident, unexpected, freak occurrence, etc. So let's see. So the Gemara explains. So Rava, the one who says that the Mishna is referring to a case where another animal pushed it, in which case the owner pays only for the benefit that the animal derived and is exempt from paying for the damage caused, right? What it ate, yes. Maybe what it crushed when it fell on it because it softened the fall, but not any other damage that it did by trampling around. Holds that all the more so this law would apply in a case where the animal slipped on its urine, which is beyond the owner's control. But Rav Kahana, the one who says that the Mishnah is referring to a case where the animal slipped on its urine, holds that if, however, another animal pushed it, this indicates that the owner was negligent and should have prevented this from happening. Therefore, in such a case, the owner pays for what his animal damaged, since the owner of the garden can say to the owner of the animal, you should have led your animals across one by one so that they would not push each other. So maybe this is somebody's garden patch which is under a bridge. And it was when the animals were crossing the bridge that one of them fell off. And so maybe the owner of the animals was negligent in the way that he led them across the bridge such that one of them could end up falling off. So Rav Kahana says they taught only that the owner pays for the benefit that it derives in the same garden bed in which it fell. But if it went from one garden bed to another garden bed and it ate from that one, well, the owner pays for what it damaged. And Rabbi Yochanan says, even if the animal goes from one garden bed to another garden bed and eats, and even if the animal continues going from one bed to another and eating the entire day, the owner pays only for the benefit that the animal derived, right? What it would have cost the owner to feed his animal, that he has to pay for. But the damage that it did after it entered, without the owner willfully leading that animal in or even being negligent, then all the rest of the damages, the owner of the animal is exempt from paying the owner of the land. And this is so unless the animal leaves that garden entirely and then returns to the garden with the owner's knowledge, presumably the owner of the animal. And Rav Papa said, explaining Rabbi Yochanan's statement, do not say this means unless the animal leaves with the owner's knowledge and returns with his knowledge. Rather, once it leaves the garden with the owner's knowledge, even if it returned without his owner's knowledge, the owner is still liable to pay for what it damaged. And what is the reason for this? It is that the owner of the garden can say to the owner of the animal, since the animal has now learned that there's a garden there with food to eat, every time it strays, it will go there. And you know it because you've seen that your animal learned that there's good eating there. So now it's on you to safeguard your animal from entering that property ever again. And if it does enter, you're fully to blame, not only for what it eats, but any damage that it does. The Mishnah teaches if the animal descended into the garden in its usual manner and caused damage, there the owner pays for what it damaged, right? So this is different. Now, not it fell in some freak occurrence, but rather the animal entered the neighbor's property, of course, in the usual way that animals do. So, of course, the owner of the animal is going to be liable not only for what his animal eats, but any damage that it causes on the neighbor's property. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, if the animal descended in its usual manner and gave birth to a calf there and damaged the produce with amniotic fluid, then what is the law? Does the owner of the animal have to pay for this damage? So the concept here is the owner of the animal was negligent and allowed his animal to stray into the neighbor's property. But then there was an unpredictable accident, right, in that the animal gave birth while it was on the neighbor's property, and then when the amniotic fluid spilled out, that caused a bunch of damage. Right, so that was not a foreseeable accident. You could say you have to have a responsibility to safeguard your animals from entering your neighbor's property. But no one expected this would happen. So do we say, as the Gemara will now explain, do we say that since there was negligence at the outset, then any damages that ensue, even if they were not foreseeable and were accidental in nature, are nevertheless the liability of the animal's owner? Or do we say, well, it started in negligence, and any damages that result directly from the negligence, he's liable for. But this unexpected, accidental freak occurrence of the amniotic fluid spilling all over the place, that was not predictable, and that's not something that the owner of the animal will be liable for. Those are the two sides of the debate. So the Gemara clarifies Rabbi Yirmiyah's question. Do not raise this dilemma in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that one is liable in case of damage that is initially through negligence and ultimately by accident, since in this case the owner was negligent in allowing the animal to enter another person's courtyard, although the actual causing of the damage was ultimately by accident. So when should you raise this dilemma? Raise it in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that one is exempt in a case that is initially through negligence and ultimately by accident. So what is the law in that case? The two sides of the question are like this. Do we say that since this case is initially through negligence and ultimately by accident, that he is exempt from liability? Or perhaps here, in this case, it is entirely due to his negligence. Since he saw that the animal was close to giving birth, he should have safeguarded it adequately and taken care of it, and he bears responsibility for doing so. What's the answer? Teiku. It was left unresolved. And the Gemara moves on. Now we're on page 58b. The Mishnah teaches, how does the court appraise the value of the damage when the owner pays for what the animal damaged? And the court appraises, as we've learned, a large piece of land with an area required for sowing 1 sa of seed in that field, right? So in other words, a sa is a unit of volume. So think of it as a sack, right? A sack, maybe this big, full of seed. So how big a field do you need to sow all that seed? That field is called, the size of that field is called a base sa, right? Call it the house of a sa, but the concept is, right, think of it as an acre. A base sa is like an acre, okay? And it's the size of a field needed to sow a sa of seed. I don't really know exactly how big that is, but just, to get a mental picture, think of it as something like an acre. Okay? So the court appraises a large piece of land with an area required for sowing 1 sa of seed, and this is a base sa, in that field, including the garden bed in which the damage took place. It appraises how much this whole base sa of land was worth before the animal damaged it, and how much it is worth now, and the owner must pay the difference. We've seen that before. Now the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? So Rav Matana says, as the verse states, Exodus 22:4, and it, the animal, feed in another field, uvier bizde acher. And this teaches that the court appraises the damage relative to another field, i.e. relative to the damaged field as a whole, and not an appraisal of only the specific garden bed that was damaged, right? In other words, think of it this way. I have a backyard. I live in a nice city. I want to create a little vegetable garden in my backyard. How much is it going to cost me to install a vegetable garden in my backyard in a metropolitan area? You could spend quite a bit of money doing something like that. Maybe $1,000, maybe $10,000. I don't know. I haven't done it. So that's just the garden bed by itself. If you say, okay, well, out here in the country, we have a field. It's an acre-wide field, and this acre field includes 10 garden beds, alongside the corn. That is the majority of what's planted in that field. But I also have 10 vegetable gardens. And if I now damage one of the vegetable beds of those 10 within my acre of field that also includes a bunch of corn planted, how much value has the whole field lost because one of the garden beds was damaged? The answer is going to be very little difference, much less than the $1,000 or $10,000 it would take to create a single garden bed by itself, in the city or somewhere, or even in the country. And so that's what they're saying. When you're talking about the damage that it does, the court is going to assess a much smaller number than perhaps the owner of the garden bed would like, because the assessment is done as in the context of the whole field. How much did this damage diminish the value of your field? Not what would it take to replace the garden bed. And the Gemara asks, but this phrase that you used in the verse from Exodus 22:4, uvier bizde acher, can be understood as meaning, and the animal feed not in another field, but in another person's field. And accordingly, is necessary to teach that the owner is not liable unless it was a field with an owner, to exclude damage caused by an animal in the public domain, for which the owner is not liable. Right? So in other words, if you're using that verse to derive the law that for the owner of the animal to be liable, his animal has to do damage on private property as opposed to public property, then that phrase is not available to learn out the law that when we assess damages, it is in the context of a whole field and not just a garden bed by itself. So the Gemara answers, if so, if this was the sole intention of the verse, then let the merciful one write in the Torah, and it feed in a field belonging to another, uvier bizde chavero, or alternatively, let it write, and it consume another field, sede acher. What is conveyed by the particular expression in another field, bizde acher? It is to teach that the court appraises the damage relative to another field. But why not say that this verse comes entirely for this purpose, i.e. to teach the court appraises the damage relative to another field? And in that case, from where do we derive the exclusion of liability for damage by eating in the public domain? And the Gemara says, if it is so that the verse was referring solely to the method of appraising the damage, the merciful one should have written this in the Torah in the context of payment as follows: his best quality field and the best quality of his vineyard he shall pay in another field. See also Exodus 22:4. Thereby adding the term in another field, and by extension the directive concerning how the damage is appraised, to the verse discussing payment. Why do I need the merciful one to write it in the context of the act of damaging in the verse, and it feed in another field? Conclude two conclusions from it. The verse is referring to both the place where the damage occurred and the method by which the damage is appraised. So the Gemara asks, how do we, the court, appraise the value of the damage? Okay, we got this idea that it's going to be how much is the value of the field diminished by this damage in a garden bed within the whole field. Okay, but how do we measure the amount of money that it's going to cost? So Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina says, the court appraises the value of an area required for sowing 1 sah of seed, this is a base sah, relative to an area required for sowing 60 sah of seed, 60 base sah. And according to this calculation determines the value of the damage. And Rabbi Yanai says the court appraises each tarkov equivalent to half a base sah relative to an area of 60 tarkov. And Chizkiah says the court appraises the value of each stalk eaten relative to 60 stalks. So now it sounds like not only are we going to compare a garden bed and how it diminishes one field, but even we're going to say, and the value of this field, if it was lying within a much larger field, 60 times bigger, how would the mega field, how would its value be reduced? Sounds like the owner of the land is not going to get too much in damages. So the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa. If an animal ate 1 kav or 2 kav, the court does not say that the owner pays compensation according to their value, i.e. the value of the actual damage. Rather, they view it as if it was a small garden bed and evaluate accordingly. And what? Is it not that this means that the court evaluates the garden bed according to what it would cost if sold by itself, which contradicts all the previous explanations? Now, again, we're talking about damage, not benefit. Right? So whatever the animal benefited, the amount of food that it actually ate which the owner now doesn't have to feed it because it ate on the neighbor's land, that he has to pay for, regardless. What we're talking about is damage, right? So damage sounds like we're always going to compare what was lost to the reduction in value of something 60 times bigger. And the Gemara rejects this interpretation where it said, no, you just pay for what you damaged. For a moment, it said, isn't that like the same as benefit? You just pay for what you damage. But the Gemara rejects this. No, it means that the court appraises the value in relation to an area 60 times greater. And the sages taught when appraising the damage, the court does not appraise it based on the area of a base kav, because doing so enhances his position, and they also do not appraise it relative to an area of a base core, which is equivalent to an area in which one can plant 30 sa of seed, because this weakens his position. So the Gemara asks, what is this Baraisa saying? And Rav Papa said, this is what it is saying. The court does not appraise the value of one kav relative to an area of 60 kav, which, being too large for an individual but too small for a trader, is always sold in the market at a lower price, because that would enhance the position of the one liable for the damage. Conversely, the court does not appraise the value of a core relative to an area of 60 core, an area so large that it is purchased only by a person with a specific need and therefore for a high price, because that would weaken the position of one liable for damage. And Rav Huna bar Menoach objects to this. According to this interpretation, this term employed by the Baraisa, and they also do not appraise it relative to an area of a base core, is imprecise. According to the explanation of Rav Papa, the Baraisa should have said, and they also do not appraise it relative to a core, to parallel the term in the previous clause, which was a kav. So rather, Rav Huna bar Manoach said in the name of Rav Acha, son of Rav Ika, and this is what the Baraisa is teaching. The court does not appraise a kav by itself, because that would enhance the position of the injured party, nor does the court appraise a kav as part of a base core, because that would weaken the position of the injured party, since damage inside such a large area is insignificant. Rather, the court appraises the damage in relation to an area 60 times greater than the area that was damaged. That's the principle. It's not 360 times greater. It's not 10 times greater. It's always you appraise it as if it was an area 60 times greater than the amount that was damaged, and then see how its value would be reduced. Excuse me. The Gemara relates, there was a certain man who cut down a date palm, a kashba, that belonged to another person. And the owner of the tree came with the perpetrator for arbitration before the Exilarch. So the Exilarch is the head of the Jewish community in Bava during the time that the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, is being created. And that is part of the Persian Empire. It's no longer Babylonia. It's the Babylonian Jewish community, but it's part of the Persian Empire. And the Exilarch is the head of the Jewish community in exile. And that's why he's called an Exilarch as opposed to a monarch. So let me just read to you a little bit of background about the Exilarch. We've definitely, and usually the Exilarch, like Mar Ukva, like when you hear a sage named Mar Ukva, the term of respect, the title, Mar, M-A-R, means that he was the Exilarch. So here, the Exilarch, who descended from the house of David, was recognized by the Jews as the heir to the throne of Judah and entrusted with broad official powers. He was the leader of the Jews of the Persian Empire and their representative to the authorities, who regarded him as a member of a royal dynasty. Consequently, he enjoyed a lofty position within the Persian court. During various periods, he was considered third in the royal hierarchy. He was responsible for the collection of a major portion of the government taxes and could appoint leaders and judges whose powers included the imposition of corporal and sometimes capital punishment. Adjacent to the Exilarch's home was a special rabbinical court appointed by him to judge monetary cases and, in particular, cases concerning property. He also seems to have had the authority to appoint people to certain positions throughout the country, although most appointments were made in consultation with the heads of the great academies. The Exilarchs themselves were referred to in the Talmud by the honorific title, Mar, before or after their name, and were devoted to the Torah. Some were significant scholars in their own right, like Mar Ukva. Okay. So now we have this incident where somebody had, a few palm trees, date palms. Somebody came along and cut down one of the trees, and the owner takes the perpetrator before the court of the Exilarch. The Exilarch said to the perpetrator, I personally saw that place where the date palm was planted, and it actually contained 3 date palms, talata, standing together in a cluster, growing out of a single root, and they were worth altogether 100 dinars. Consequently, since you, the perpetrator, cut down one of the 3, go and give him 33 and 1/3 dinars, 1/3 of the total value. Sounds perfectly reasonable. The perpetrator rejected this ruling and said, why do I need to be judged by the Exilarch, who rules according to Persian law? He came before Rav Nachman for judgment in the same case, who said to him, the court appraises the damage in relation to an area 60 times greater than the damage caused, and that amount is much less than 33 and 1/3 dinars. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that Rav Nachman was not aware that this person had already come before the Exilarch and received a ruling before he went and consulted what is the law with Rav Nachman. Now, that is the law, as we've learned, that you appraise the damage relative to an area 60 times larger. But that's also when we're talking about an animal doing damage. This guy directly cut down the tree. So, I think the Exilarch has good reason for saying, well, you personally cut down the tree. Isn't that where it started? There was a certain man who cut down a date palm, right? So he, with his own force, not through an animal that he owned, he himself cut down the tree. Maybe Rav Nachman got this wrong. It's hard to say. Rava said to Rav Nachman, if the sages said that the court appraises damage caused by one's property, such as his animal, relative to an area 60 times greater, would they also say that the court appraises damage relative to an area 60 times greater, even for the direct damage caused by one's body? Abaye said to Rava, with regard to damage caused by one's body, what is your opinion? Are you basing your opinion on the following, as it is taught in a Baraisa, if one destroys the vineyard of another while the grapes are budding, semadar, the court views how much the vineyard was worth before he destroyed it and how much it is worth afterward? Abaye states the inference, whereas the method of appraising 1 part in 60 is not taught. Is the basis of your ruling the fact that in this Baraisa that discusses damage caused directly by a person, the method of appraising 1 part in 60 is not mentioned? And Abaye continued, is that to say that with regard to damage caused by an animal, it is not taught in a Mishna or Baraisa without mentioning the method of appraising 1 part in 60 like this case? But this is not so, as it is taught in a Baraisa, if an animal broke down a sapling that had not yet borne fruit, Rabbi Yosei says those who issue decrees in Jerusalem say that the damages are determined based on a fixed formula. If the sapling was in its first year, the owner of the animal pays 2 pieces of silver. If the sapling was 2 years old, he pays 4 pieces of silver. If the animal ate unripe blades of grain used for pasture, Rabbi Yosei HaGalili says it is judged according to what remains of it, i.e. the court waits until the rest of the field ripens and then appraises the value of what was previously eaten. And the rabbis say the court views how much the field was worth before he destroyed it and how much it is worth now. Now we're actually going to just go a little bit of the way into page 59a, but I'm almost done. So if the animal ate grapes while they were budding in the budding stage, Rabbi Yehoshua says the court views the grapes that were damaged as if they were grapes about to be picked and appraised the damage based on this. And the rabbis say the court views how much the vineyard was worth before the animal ate the grapes and how much it is worth now. And Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, in what case is this statement that the court appraises the vineyard or group of trees that were damaged said? It is when the animal ate young branches or vines or shoots of fig trees. But where it ate unripe figs or unripe grapes, the court views them and appraises them as if they were grapes ready to be picked. And Abaye continues, in any event, It teaches that the rabbis say the court views how much the vineyard was worth before the animal ate the produce and how much it is worth now. And it does not teach that the court appraises the damage relative to an area of 60 times greater, which we said is how the court appraises when an animal eats. But in that barais, it didn't say anything about the animal eating. So are we going to say that just because when we talk about somebody doing damage with his body to somebody else's property, that as when we assess the damage done, where, the barais doesn't mention this appraisal using 60 times greater, even though that wasn't mentioned in the barais, that doesn't mean that we don't use that system, is the point that's being made. But the big distinction is there's a difference between my animal eating and me doing the damage. So rather, what have you to say? You must say that the wording employed by the barais is to be understood to mean that the court appraises the damage relative to an area 60 times greater. So here too, in the barais dealing with one who himself causes damage, the wording is to be understood to mean that the damage is valued relative to an area 60 times greater. Right? That's where we're going to interrupt today's stop, and we'll continue tomorrow, because it sounds like, come on, no way. The guy who cuts down his neighbor's tree has to pay for the tree. You can't say, well, what is the diminished value in a piece of land in a grove of 60 trees? If you were purchasing a grove of 60 trees and you only got 59 trees, how much less would you pay? That's a very different outcome than the guy had 3 trees and you cut down one of them, right? And that's how Mar Ukva how the Exilarch ruled, and I think the Exilarch was right. But we haven't got back to that yet. We're going to see why this appraisal based on something worth 60 times more does or does not apply in a case of a person causing damage through his own direct force rather than his animal causing the damage. We'll continue that tomorrow. Okay, let's see if I've got a couple of questions. Joe, regarding, I guess, the first part of our discussion about an animal falling into a garden. Maybe the road is raised above the level of the garden yard and the road crumbled, allowing the animal to fall into the garden. Yes, I think that's a good explanation, a good possibility, right? But it's still some kind of freak occurrence. Now you could say, well, if the wall crumbled or the road crumbled and it had happened earlier and the person is walking his animal along the road and he sees that, there's been a landslide, okay, so he should have led his animal around that. But if maybe what you're suggesting, the person was doing, nothing negligent, walking with his animal on the road, and the road crumbled at that moment, okay, that's a freak occurrence. That was unpredictable. Why should we penalize the person who was walking on the road? That could have happened to anyone. Bad luck that the guy whose land adjoins that road got damaged when the road crumbled, but that's not the fault of the person walking his animal on the road. And that's why the owner of the animal only has to pay for the benefit that his animal received, but not the damage that it did. Sharon, I am not clear on why they are not determining the value of the damages according to where the damage occurred and under the local conditions. Why do they need to come up with a larger body for comparison? And I guess the answer was that their derivation is because the Torah seems to imply that you compare to a field and not, to a whole field and not just to the part of the field that was damaged. That's the reason they do it. The rabbinic courts are not going to step in and transfer money from a defendant to a plaintiff unless there is strong reason to do so, right? They're discouraging tort lawyers because litigation is not going to be that successful. So don't bother us with these kinds of things. They'll make the transfer if the proof can be done, but the appraisal, it definitely diminishes what the person who is damaged can expect. That's what it seems to be. Bill, Mar, this honorific title, Mar, was more or less the Aramaic equivalent of Lord in the secular sense. Like my lord, right? The noble who owns the castle up the street, right? And you call him my lord. Other leaders of minority populations in the Sassanid Empire in Persia and later the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphate empires were also referred to by that name. Particularly Christian bishops were, as well as the heads of certain tribal populations. Thank you. Very interesting. And Sharon, what if there was a blight on the field where the animal ate, and destroyed the remaining crop, is the damage considered to be nothing in the end? I mean, the causation, right, which seems to be the dispositive element of this, was not through the negligence of the owner. Now, I think a wonderful question would be, and so therefore I think the owner of the field would be out of luck. But if we say that the animal entered through the negligence of the animal's owner, right, the second case where it entered in the normal manner, not through some freak occurrence where it fell into the field, but it entered in the normal manner. Okay, and while it was there, it ate, some cucumbers in the vegetable patch, trampled, some tomatoes in the tomato patch, and then it left. But like what you're talking about, like it brought some kind of, plant virus with it that caught, and ended up destroying the whole crop of the owner of the land. Now, can that be proven? I think if it can be proven, this would seem like negligence that led to an accident, right? Where the consequences of the accident were much larger than the direct consequences of the negligence, which was the eating some cucumbers and trampling some tomatoes. The fact that the whole field died, this was unexpected by everyone. No one could have foreseen that. That wasn't predictable. So, according to the view that something that begins in negligence, even if it leads to an accident, the negligent one is liable. Yeah, he has to pay for the whole field. According to the view that what began in negligence, you're only liable for what's directly caused by the negligence, would seem like the blight was beyond the scope. But if he had any reason to know that his animal was carrying some kind of a plant virus, if his animal, had strayed in his field where a bunch of things had died, and then went onto the neighbor's property, then maybe you could say he had reason to know, and he should have safeguarded the animal because it was some kind of a typhoid cow. Then there would be a good argument that he's responsible for all the damage that the blight caused. It seems to me. That's what I've got for tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And I guess that's how we'll be kicking off our New Year's Eve. And Nina and I met on New Year's Eve all those years ago. So it's a romantic day for us tomorrow night. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.